Sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Welcome everyone to the first episode of Pod and Men at Yale of 2025. As it was last year, our first episode is with our Lux et Veritas Leadership Fellows. The program takes a select group of Yale students through a 9-month curriculum giving the skills and knowledge necessary to defend a free society. I'm Ari Schaefer, Director of Communications at the Buckley Institute and the host of the podcast. I'm happy to have here with me Hilda Barragan-Reyes, a junior.
Hello, great to be a part of this.
Abhinay Lingareddy, also a junior.
Hey, thanks for having me on the podcast, Ari.
And Eric Arabadzhiev, a freshman.
Hey, great to be here.
So thanks to all you guys for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you. What I want to talk about today is the Buckley Institute's new Yale Student Survey surveyed around 500 undergraduates in the fall. Overall, it showed improvements on free speech in the Yale student body. The number who believe the Woodward Report, that's Yale's free speech principles, should be Yale's official free speech policy, jumped from 80% to 89%. Those who support disrupting speech on campus dropped from 33% to 25%. 67%, that's up from 50% in 2023, support disciplining the students who do disrupt speech. So what do you guys think has driven this change over last year? Abhi, want to start?
Yeah, I think the main thing is I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Israel-Palestine protests that happened on campus. And I think that we saw something not so surprising, in my opinion, which is that a sort of reaction by the right to be censorious a little bit, which made, I think, this a bipartisan issue. Free speech became something the left started to care about a lot more because they can advance their goals and stage their protests without it. So I think we're starting to see a sort of convergence with the left and the right sort of starting to agree, but also some of the extremes starting to disagree on free speech. But I think that these survey results are pretty promising, showing that there's actually a little bit more agreement on basic support of free speech principles.
I mean, another side to this would be it being an election year, 2024. You have people from both sides of the aisle wanting to express what their hopes are for the coming administration. And a big part of that is being able to, express your opinion in which you require a campus that strongly supports free speech.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree mostly with Abhi. I think that there's sort of been a real shift. And I think it's a great shift, despite anyone's sort of political alignment. I think it's great that free speech on both sides is being accepted as an important issue. And, whatever issue students want to speak out on, that, they're able to speak out on them and that they're able to be supported by the administration on. So I think it is somewhat of a shift due to the Israel-Palestine issue and students realizing that in order to protest, they need to have some sort of level of free speech. In the same way that, folks on the right typically have seen themselves to be censored upon. The left experienced that maybe a little bit as well last spring. So I think overall it's a positive shift that, people are recognizing more and more the importance and the value of free speech across political alignments.
So I do want to follow up on that for Eric and Abhi and Hilda. You're welcome to jump in about how you think the dynamic of Israel-Palestine and how it was responded to on campus and, the inclination towards censoring some views or others might have changed people's perspectives. What do you think the outlook was before? Who were the holdouts on free speech and, how did the discussion on campus around Israel-Palestine change their outlook, do you think?
I think that if you think about free speech before, I think that Israel-Palestine, and you sort of think about, especially on the university campus, what sort of perspectives were maybe somewhat being censored, or certainly I think the right's perspectives, right? But I think that we saw with the Israel-Palestine protests was that I think there's a huge reaction by the right. There is a lot of conservative donors. I'm sure some of you are familiar with there's a truck going around Yale's campus with just the names of all the protesters with the intention to blacklist these people from employment. So I think that like on the university campus specifically, the left hadn't sort of seen this like backlash from the conservative movement since like maybe the 1950s, during the Red Scare, maybe, where like there was like a sort of a real going after the left. So I think the left understood the consequences of not having their free speech for the first time.
Eric, thoughts, Hilda?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. There definitely was, I think, an overreaction and sort of the right taking on the censorious role that they previously had sort of despised. After there was a huge movement by donors and by certain employers to not hire people that had protested or signed on to certain documents stating a certain position around this issue. And, I think the left, like Abhi was saying, got to see the sort of effects of that. And I think, across the board, that sort of censorious behavior is not one that we should be welcoming onto a campus that is supposedly its mission is to seek truth. And obviously people have different perceptions of that, and we should be open to as many ideas as possible and not be censorious of those.
So Hilda, I just want to move on to the next part of that, because while all the data got better overall, there still is a decent chunk who are, I guess, as Buckley would say it, on the wrong side of these free speech issues. A quarter still support shoutdowns of speech they don't like. 20% support using violence to stop hate speech, which is protected by the First Amendment. Still 39%, it is down from 44%, say they self-censor regularly. What is the instinct, do you think, both to censor and self-censor? Where does that come from? Like, what drives it?
Well, the instinct to censor is to protect, in part. A big kind of stance on the left would be that hate speech kind of inhibits some people's ability to fully participate in a culture of free speech. If you feel offended or threatened, then perhaps you don't feel safe to share your opinions with others. And in the instinct to self-censor, then that comes from a want to belong to the group that you are with, or to appease the professor that is directing some sort of class that you're taking, because you want the grade, or you want the professor to hold a high opinion of you. And the need to self-censor, of course, is stronger on the right than it is on the left, as an incredible majority of Yale professors are on the left and donate to democratic institutions and the Democratic Party. But I think the situation has vastly improved over the past year.
Do you ever feel the need to self-censor?
As an economics major, I don't necessarily take too many seminars, but in the one or two that I've taken during my time at Yale, I definitely have held back on certain views, and most of the time I do share what's on my mind, but I do see kind of a negative reaction from fellow peers in the seminar.
How about you, Abhi? Do you ever feel the need to self-censor? Do you want to talk maybe a little bit on the larger dynamic?
Yeah, I sort of just want to respond to, I think, the sort of dynamic that Hilda just pointed out. So the perspective, I think, where I think censorship comes from, I think the instinct for censorship comes from, is that I think there is somewhat of a perspective that censorship itself is a form of speech. Like some of these things, like Shoutdowns and all these things, are like a form of the way for people, the audience, to respond to the speaker, and that, like Hilda was pointing out, the negative reactions. But what I think speech should be about is like not necessarily how the audience reacts, but like how do we elevate the speaker themselves? Like how do we make them comfortable with the fact that you're going to say something controversial which upsets people, be okay with the consequences of that. And I think it's sort of unfair to expect people not to be shocked by something you say that might be a little shocking. But I think that the thing about self-censoring, I think a lot of it is the sort of self-fulfilling narrative that I think is fueled, is that people think that everyone will respond super, super negatively and will completely blacklist you and everything. But I'm not sure that's true. And I think that these numbers are like somewhat promising, right? Like 89% supporting the Woodward report. And that like maybe like the thing that we should start focusing on is like, how do we get these people that are like, fueled by this narrative to like start coming out and saying the things they believe rather than trying to change how the audience like reacts to like controversial statements.
Yeah, I mean, there was also a great piece in, I think, Publius is the name of it, where it basically described that a lot of conservative students might actually have an advantage over, certain students that sort of subscribe to the majority at Yale because they are constantly faced with questions, and something about not being a part of a majority means that you have to defend your views versus I think a lot of where the censorship culture comes from is that if everyone agrees with you, you never really have to take account for what you actually believe because everyone's already on your side. And so the more and more people that don't agree with you, the less that can become the case. And that's, I think, what drives a lot of the censorship. And again, I think this is an issue across political aisles. It's not just, one side. Both, I think, are guilty of it, but it's something, like Abhi said, it's promising that so many of these students are in agreement with things like the Woodward report.
So I do want to drill down on an interesting point that Abhi made, because I've seen this argument made before, and I'm curious what you guys think. The idea that shoutdowns are a form of free speech. And I don't know if Abhi endorsed it or it's just like sharing the perspective. But it's an interesting argument, I have my own thoughts, but I'm curious, what do you guys think? Hilda, you want to start us off?
Well, it is certainly a form of literal speech, shouting someone down, but I don't think it's a form of speech that we should either endorse or encourage, because ultimately in a shoutdown, the whole point is to stop the opposing person's view from being heard, which the point of free speech should be to listen to all sides, regardless of what is being espoused. And then there are other forms of censorship that I wouldn't necessarily call free speech, like physically removing someone from an environment. But yes, that is my perspective.
I wouldn't say I completely support shoutdowns all the time. I just understand them, right? Defend them as a form of free speech. Because I disagree with you that free speech is about listening to all sides. I think free speech is about talking, right? Speech doesn't mean listening. It means the act of talking, right? Or the act of expressing your thoughts. So I think that shoutdowns are a valid form of expression that people get angry, and that I think that when we say that shoutdowns aren't valid, that we're saying that the point is to censor this emotion that people feel, that people will be angry, people will shout. And I think that the answer isn't less speech. The answer is, I think, in my opinion, always more speech. How do we encourage speakers to shout back, right? That. I think that's the answer. The answer is not how do we stop these people from shouting? It's how do we get the speaker to shout back? How do we get more people to come out in support of the people that are speaking?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think in this context, if someone's shouting someone down simply to make them go away and make their opinions go away, I actually think that reduces the credibility of their own arguments, because they're showcasing that they're not willing to engage in actual discourse around what they believe, but rather just want to shut down the people that don't believe the way that they do. I think, like Abhi said, the best way to combat what you view as bad speech or uninformed speech is by having better speech and informing those who disagree with you what you actually believe, and actually having a chance of maybe persuading them or showing them something that they might not have considered, rather than sort of stooping down to the step of shouting someone down, which again just showcases to the other side that you're completely unwilling to even engage with their ideas on any level. Just
to clarify, I completely agree with that. And I'm not endorsing shouting down as productive, but I don't think I don't think the form of speech should always be productive, right? I don't think that's the only value of speech, and I think speech is often a form of expression. So I agree with Eric that I do think it's somewhat of a lesser form of speech, but one that should still be defended equally as all other forms.
Yeah, I agree. It should be defended, but I just think it sort of doesn't achieve the goal that I think they're trying to go for.
Yeah, well, thank you guys I've actually always wanted to hear that argument like put back and forth. So I appreciate you guys like talking it out a little bit. So one of the standouts in the survey was the freshman class, and they really drove the numbers in a positive direction. Other classes did okay, kind of as they've done in the past. The freshman class outpolled dramatically on respecting First Amendment free speech rights on campus, on whether the Woodward report should be Yale's free speech policy. They opposed speech regulations much better than any other class, and opposed shoutdowns much better than any other class. Buckley's perspective is opposing shoutdowns is the free speech move, although disagrees, obviously. They also were more likely to support discipline for those who shout down speeches. So, Eric, you're the freshman on the panel. You want to take a victory lap?
I mean, listen, what can I say? I guess the freshman class must be the best class at Yale. But I don't know what there might be to explain it. Maybe it's just, I think a lot of students, particularly those that were applying to sort of elite institutions at Yale, being that there was so much protest and concern. I know even for me, like seeing what was taking place at events that occurred at Yale last spring, it sort of inspired a sense of, worry and sort of fear of, what if I get to campus and this culture is going on all around me, and how can I still be able to focus? Obviously current students also likely experience that, but I think it's a good sign that, younger and younger people are more and more willing to, again, engage in discourse and really, I think, go back to what's at the heart of Yale's mission, which is to disagree, to sort of battle out ideas in an intellectual way, instead of resorting to shouting people down or trying to shut down people simply for what they believe.
I think one of the things that maybe explains this is I think we're just like talking about it more. And I think this is like props to the Buckley Institute for supporting this, but also like other organizations. Like, I mean, me and Hilda are part of the Yale Political Union. And there's like some like very controversial guests that came over. We actually had a debate on banning encampments, for example, right? I think that we're starting to have these conversations. And I think that was spurred by the events of like last semester and last year. And I think that these conversations are actually like bearing fruit, and like I think they're making their mark on some very impressionable first years. Yeah.
So before we move on to other parts of the poll, I just want to ask you guys like your sense of free speech at Yale. Are you worried about the free speech environment? Do you ever worry about speaking up? Is it something you never think about? And what do you think, even if you're totally comfortable, what do you think would help build dialogue and space for dialogue on campus?
Well, I don't tend to censor. I'm pretty direct as a person. I've never really had that inclination to either censor or self-censor broadly. And I do feel relatively comfortable to share my own viewpoint at Yale. But I think it's hard to discount the consequences of expressing certain views on campus, as we saw during the Israel conflict, that's still going on. You see people unfollow each other on Instagram and, remove people from kind of a meaningful friendship. I think when it comes to improving free speech on campus, there are certain limitations to things that we could do at the administrative level. And I think a lot of it comes down to personal relationships with other people. As long as people are willing to have friendships with people across the aisle, I think that's the most important vehicle for improving free speech on campus. If you're willing to kind of form a meaningful relationship with someone that thinks very different from how you think. And of course, the president can emphasize the importance of free speech on campus, but ultimately it's about the conversations we choose to have and the people we choose to have them with.
So one of the questions we asked in the survey was actually how many Yale students would count someone of the opposite political opinion among their close friends. And the numbers were, I think, over 50%, something like that. I could be misremembering. I don't have it in front of me. There was a little bit of an ideological and partisan divide, but instead of focusing on that, I want to ask you guys, take a second. Would you consider among your close friends at Yale, extended friend group, people who have wildly different opinions than you do?
Yeah. And I think that's like what's made my Yale experience, I think, so great, is that I have friends like all over the political spectrum, but not just politically, but just sort of like from a sort of perspective on life. They're just from all over and have all these different views. And I think that's like the value of Yale, is that there's so many people from like different walks of life, different perspectives, different ideological perspectives, and different classes, professors with different like takes on everything. That like, this is the value of Yale. And I think everyone should take advantage of that. And I get sad when I hear people that like are friends with people just like them, or like stay in their own groups and stay in their own echo chambers.
How about you, Eric?
Yeah, I'd say so as well. And I completely agree. I think the best conversations I have are with people that disagree with me. And, I've changed my opinion on certain things because certain people have, presented a view that I hadn't considered before. And this is why I think, free speech is something that really should be cherished and celebrated by both sides of the aisle. And I have friends that, as this survey shows, are supportive of it, on both sides, because I think it brings the opportunity for these ideas to be engaged with, to be able to persuade people. And instead of resorting to sticking with your own circle or, being friends with someone only because they agree with you politically, which I think is, a weird choice to make, to be friends with someone only because they happen to agree with you on certain issues of policy. But, I think, the more and more ideas and speech are accepted, the more and more, the best idea will win. And I think as long as that's accepted, there shouldn't really be some sort of ideological divide on this issue at all.
So I want to move on to one other question in this survey, institutional neutrality. Yale adopted public comment guidelines for administrators, Yale leaders speaking in an official capacity in the fall, but they were very specific that it was not institutional neutrality. There's debate about what the daylight is between the two, but in the survey we did ask students whether they supported institutional neutrality, and 60% of students said they wanted it. What do you guys think about institutional neutrality?
I think there's a lot of confusion as to what institutional neutrality means. Some people think it's the administration not taking a stance on a certain political issue. Other people think that it has to include professors kind of not going on the media and expressing a certain view. I think it's mainly the administration. Institutional neutrality is about kind of avoiding an official kind of public stance on some sort of hot button issue. And I think this emphasizes free speech on campus, because if the university isn't officially endorsing a certain side, then students feel like they're more able to freely express their own opinions. I don't know, Abhi, do you have...
He's like jumping out of his seat.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I always get confused when people say that institutional neutrality is sort of antithetical to free speech. Because I point to an institution that isn't neutral, but has free speech, or at least allegedly has free speech, which is the United States, right? The United States, for example, takes stances. People vote on issues, and the United States acts on those issues. And I think we still can protect free speech. And I think this is particularly important for Yale as an institution. And as you can see, I'm against institutional neutrality because I think there are wrongs, right? I think there are things that we should be critiquing, that Yale has power, Yale has money, and what is all that money for? And what is all that power for and influence for if we're just gonna be institutionally neutral? Even is that even possible? Because I think that's the other thing, is that Yale does take stances and they hide behind, we're institutionally neutral. And I think Yale should take stances. But I don't think that will inhibit free speech. I think that we can have great conversations and great debates about Yale's official stance. That Yale having a stance doesn't stop me from disagreeing with the stance they take.
I think the question is though, like, what does Yale having a stance even mean? Like, what is Yale? And like we were talking about, if we have all these friends who are across different belief systems and ideologies from us, that just represents the diversity of opinion that there is at Yale. So what does Yale believing something actually mean? And I think that's where it becomes sort of a slippery slope where because you are affiliated with Yale and Yale has a view, therefore you're also affiliated with the view, even though you might not believe what Yale's view is. And I think I've also talked with professors that say, if a department, for example, comes up with a institutional view, well, then what incentive is there to pursue research opposite of that view if the department already has that view? So I think, again, if the university itself is going to be committed to intellectual clashes and people of different beliefs, then I think it's vastly suppressive for a university to sort of put on a belief onto everyone that they represent in saying that Yale has a view, because all of these people that are affiliated with it.
And I definitely agree with that, Abhi, when you mentioned people kind of being part of the country and the United States expressing a view. I think that's very different from Yale expressing a view, because Yale ultimately is a private institution, and the president of Yale and the administration of Yale aren't chosen by Yale students, versus Congress and the president are chosen by the citizens of a country.
Sure. I think you bring the valid point of like who should be making these decisions, right? I have my preferences, right? Because I'm a big fan of democracy. But obviously, there's no clear understanding of how that would happen. And I do think that anyone that's talking about institutional neutrality should probably explain that first. But to talk about your guys' second points, right? Yale is a private institution, but Yale has also been a public force. And I think it's it should be a force. I think that there is a moral imperative to be a force with all the power it has, right? I often think, right, should Yale not have a stance on the Holocaust? What about segregation? What about all the evils of the world, right? And I think that Yale should, in my opinion, are you guys saying it shouldn't? And that's completely valid if you say it shouldn't. But I'm saying it should. But I'm also saying is that I just don't think it inhibits free speech, right? It's that I think as long as Yale maintains the value of free speech while having these stances, we're saying you can disagree with the stance that we decide upon, that institutional neutrality can go away. That free speech is a separate.
The question is who's informing the stance then? If the stance is not coming from the student body that disagrees on what the stance should be, why is there disagreement if Yale believes something?
I mean, there's different ways to go about it, right? So, one way to, go about, issuing a stance is, the board of trustees decide something, right? Another way is, the faculty sort of body decides upon something. Another way is the students go in a referendum and they decide on something. I don't know which way they'll decide, or, if that's, I think at the moment it's the board of trustees mostly, right? So, what I'm saying is that, Yale is an institution, it has actions that it can take, right? It has things that inform those actions. Let them take the actions, right? And me as an individual within that institution, I can still disagree with the actions they take. Just because I'm affiliated with it, yeah, I should critically evaluate that affiliation, right? And say that to have this force that Yale has no power, that Yale can even be institutionally neutral at all is kind of crazy to me. What I'm also saying is that okay, let's take the example of Calhoun College. I was pro renaming Calhoun College, right? So how do you do that without as an institution condemning slavery? Right? How do you make decisions, right? So for example, let's say Yale is pro affirmative action or Yale's anti affirmative action, the steps it takes. How do you be pro affirmative action, right, without first condemning slavery? And how do you be anti affirmative action without taking a stance on the political issue of affirmative action?
Well, I think that goes back to the question of whether we should have renamed Calhoun College and whether we should have affirmative action.
Yeah, which I think what another common argument against institutional neutrality is that it does take a stance. And what it takes a stance for is the status quo, right? That like it prefers everything that already exists, and it says like anything to change that like is like maybe not valid.
Well, this has been great. Yeah. So we've been going on so long. This discussion is fantastic. But I think I just kind of wrap it up because we've had a full episode here, and I just want to thank you guys for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale, and maybe we'll do another episode where you guys just hash it out more on institutional neutrality and free speech. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now to our interview with Alec Torres, an accomplished speechwriter, on writing a great speech and writing for great moments. I'd like to welcome Alec Torres to the podcast. Alec is the co-founder and president of Allograph, a writing communications and design firm. He's written for some of the most prominent leaders in the world, including President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy. It's been published widely in pretty much every major news outlet you can think of. He's here leading our Lux et Veritas Leadership Fellows program and a session on speechwriting. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
So we'll just jump right into it. What do you think are some of the greatest speeches of all time?
I wish you would have warned me with that question beforehand because I have such underwhelming answers, mostly because it's the cop-out answers. I like can't answer, or when I do, it's the layups like I Have a Dream,
right,
and the Gettysburg Address. But the reason they're so good is because the reason everyone knows them is because they're so good. They are just classics. And, it's like if somebody says, what's your favorite book? And you're like, the Iliad or the Bible or, Paradise Lost. It's like, okay, well, that's everyone else's favorite too, Moby Dick, but there's reasons for it. So
right, it's that question in your mind, like, do I try and pull some like niche thing no one's ever heard of out just to like seem like I know what's going on, or like just like go with the classics?
Yeah, and I'm just a classicist at heart, so I'm always going to go with the classics. But anything that you can continue to read time and again and get enjoyment out of and find worth in is just is by its roots going to be my favorite.
So what do you think makes those speeches so memorable? Like, why is the Gettysburg Address, I Have a Dream, why have they stood the test of time? And I ask this like from someone who's like is a speechwriter. Like, what about those speeches do you think has made them last?
Well, there are certainly technical aspects of them that are good. If they were written and delivered in different ways, they would not be as good. But you have to acknowledge too that so much of it is circumstance. It's being set up at the right point in history. You can only give the Gettysburg Address after an event, a monumental turning point event like Gettysburg. You can only have the I Have a Dream speech, and as the civil rights movement is coming to a head and boiling, and the country is having this massive wake up call, and their locations matter too. It's MLK gave thousands of, if not tens of thousands of phenomenal speeches, but the moment itself set it up. So what makes a great speech is the unity of having a moment worthy of greatness and then meeting the moment with something beautiful and something profound. And that leads into what I think elevates these speeches as well, and what they are is that with simplicity, with a sort of poetic simplicity, they address the profound in a memorable way. And all the best speeches will have that. They'll be about something that's greater. They'll take the event that it's in and make it about something greater, aspirational, and truly human.
So a part of the other part of this leadership program, this retreat, I've been reading Socrates, or reading Plato, Plato's Gorgias, one of the dialogues. And in the dialogue, Socrates, they're discussing rhetoric and its value and what it does. And Socrates has this point where he says rhetoric, speech making has some kind of magic to it that he can't describe. Magic inspires people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, and sometimes do things they couldn't otherwise do. You're a speechwriter. You've helped out with some of the most powerful speeches the president's given around the world. How do you understand like that kind of magic, that ability of a speech to inspire people to greater things?
Well, Socrates is right in saying that. I guess Plato, I don't know who would have said it in the dialogues, but it's there in any craft, if you're good enough at it over time and devote yourself to it, you'll hit those flow points where it's almost like you're not working. It can be with your hands, it can be with your mind, but you know the material, you know the subject matter, you know the event, you know everything about it enough that the creativity, the creative aspect of it can then flow through you freely without blockages. The ancients would call it the muse, or maybe an inspiration of the spirit in more Christian terms. But either way, that happens, and it truly is something outside of yourself. I knew there was one moment in which I needed to write a speech, and I had a young kid at the time, and I was up all night. So physically, I was not in the right space for it. I had a headache when I woke up from being, just up and down the whole night. I was exhausted, and I had a deadline. So on material terms, it just really wasn't a good circumstance, but that spiritual aspect of it sort of came in and infused itself. And while it was a tough speech to write, I could just feel that things were landing right. So I don't know how to describe it either. But sometimes it's there, and many times it's not. It happens infrequently enough. But you feel, it's almost like you write something down, you're like, wow, that was good, and I don't even know if it was me.
So how do you try to replicate that, right? There is that magical quality, that there's that something in the speech, like you said, that this is a good speech. As a speechwriter, advice to other people who want to write speeches, what do you think is the best way to get there?
Well, the biggest thing is the work that comes in behind it. All you can do is set yourself up and be receptive to it in many ways. So if you're, you have to read a lot. You have to have a lot of material to draw from, because if you have to sit there researching a ton, and many speeches will require hard research, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're researching everything or trying to remind yourself of that story, that anecdote, that historical reference, you'll lose the flow. So having that background work, and then these only came after years of working in the job when I had been writing so much that I broke through any writer's block that I would ever have. So I wasn't afraid of a blank page. I wasn't getting caught up in things. I could just work. And then a trick that doesn't guarantee this but helps is I try to unlock in my own mind why I personally should care about what I'm writing about. Why does it actually matter? And it can't just be something like, well, I'm being paid to write this and I really like to be able to afford groceries. That's not enough. So, and sometimes it's harder. If I'm writing a speech on financial services, that's a really tough one to figure out why it matters. But even then, I can draw it. I'm like, I love home ownership. I love people starting businesses. There's something beautiful about, America having the free flow of commerce where people can achieve something that they've had in their heart. And you draw it out to something like that, and then it unlocks the potential for that flow.
So do you think convincing yourself to care, not to say dismissively, but like convincing yourself to be passionate about this makes it easier to kind of
very much so. And you can't you can't manipulate your emotions in that way, but you can certainly manipulate your mind to influence your emotions in many. So like, can I make myself passionate about healthcare policy or financial policy or something like that I'm writing on at any given time? No, not necessarily, but I can make myself care about what the point of it is. And it's almost like when you have kids or something like that, however many listeners do, sometimes I don't want to hang out with my kids or they're annoying me, to high heavens. But then you remind yourself of your love for them, and it makes all the interactions that much easier when your emotions aren't matching your what you want them to be. So
let's kind of take a step back. So I'm curious how you got into speech writing in the first place. What's your story? What was your path?
Yeah, it's I don't recommend people follow it because it was utterly unintentional. I wanted to be in the political world, the conservative political world, in some way when I was graduating from Yale, and it indirectly came through the Buckley program. I was applying for jobs all over the place, and a friend of mine who had interned at National Review put in a good word for me, and it's the only reason I can think they accepted me, because I really wasn't a good writer in college. I hated writing. I wasn't writing for the YDN. I barely had anything under my own name, just some essays that were mediocre. I'm terrified to look back at, but. But so I went in, and I wasn't suited to be a journalist. I realized that one very quickly, but I did like writing when it wasn't academic. And then all of a sudden, one day, I got a call from the communications director for Kevin McCarthy when he was the majority whip. My name had been given to him by another person at National Review, asked if I was interested in applying for a job. I did, was accepted, and then all of a sudden, bam, I was Kevin McCarthy's first speechwriter. So it was 4 years working for him. He was a phenomenal boss. It was a great place to work. And that's what led me to the White House. So, when you have speechwriter next to your name and all of a sudden you realize there's only a few dozen of us out there in the political world. So, you're working in a small pool.
What was that like going from, I guess, National Review, sort of doing journalism, like kind of like you said, and I described it, to like being a speechwriter at that level?
It was uninspiring. And I say that while loving what I did and how it all happened. And that's because when I was hired for Kevin McCarthy, what I didn't realize was that the staff, especially the communications director, realized that Kevin needed a speechwriter. Kevin had not accepted that he needed a speechwriter. He was capable himself. He had gotten very far without one, but because he was in a leadership position, and very soon after that, he became the majority leader after Eric Cantor lost his primary. He was giving too many events on too many varied subjects to be able to manage it shooting from the hip, however talented he is. So I spent 6 months writing speeches that he did not deliver, wondering why, if it was me, if I was bad at my job, if this was a mistake. And it took a speech that he could not wing and had to rely on me, that had it was slightly more elevated. It was honoring John Lewis, a civil rights hero. And I did well enough because he loved it. And then after that, he started giving my speeches.
So it you just kind of stuck at it, and eventually the opportunity presented itself and it worked out.
Well, yeah, my thought has always been that certainly, some things you shouldn't stick with. If you're reading a book that's bad and you stop reading it. Their time is too valuable. If you're dating somebody who's not the right fit for you, you're not going to marry them, stop dating them. There's nothing that's locking you in. But sometimes you do have to keep at things. And I was at a job, and I thought a few months at a job was not enough to quit on it, especially in a field and in an environment that I seem to like. You just have to fight through things sometimes. I mean, the best jobs, like jobs that can seem very glamorous and sexy and all of these things, are going to have drudgery. Every job has drudgery. So you have to find ways to deal with the drudgery. And if that continued and all it was drudgery, I would have had to leave. But the moment that was unlocked, and I was writing other things too. I mean, I was still having fun and learning a lot. So it's not like it was valueless. I was also writing his press releases and op-eds and things like that. So I was still getting valuable experience. But the speech writing one just had to wait to be unlocked. And I think patience was rewarded in the end.
Between writing op-eds, press releases, speeches, which do you prefer?
Well, I know that I least prefer the press releases because I hate anything that's overly responsive to just the news of the day. Flash in the pan kind of stuff is very difficult to become inspired by. In terms of op-eds or speeches, probably speeches, though ultimately I would rather take an op-ed on something I love than a speech on something I don't. So subject matter matters more. It'd almost be like asking a poet, what type of poetry he likes writing. And he could like writing all sorts of them, but you change how you express what you want to the form that your poem is in. If it has to be in a sonnet, then you find a way to do it in a sonnet, and the form itself forces you to do it in the beauty of that particular way. So
you've worked with several significant political figures, Kevin McCarthy, like you said, J.D. Vance, Donald Trump. You have any what insights about what those experiences like? Any funny stories from trying to write for these guys?
Yeah, so they are all extremely. Every person I've worked for has been extremely different, and it's just one of the quirky things about this job. With Kevin, I could walk into his office, not just waltz in, but he had his door open, and I could see if he was working on something, and I could just walk into his office and talk with him. You cannot just walk into the Oval Office and talk with your boss, who is the President of the United States. It doesn't work that way. Some people can. I was not one of them, and never aspired to be. Too much stress. But JD Vance, phenomenal to work with. He's running around on a campaign. My interactions with him were like some calls, a lot of emails, and through staff, because he went from 0 to 100 just immediately. You go from being a senator to being on the campaign trail in a matter of days, and you're building the plane while you're flying it. There's not a lot of time to chit chat and get to know somebody. Luckily, by that time, I had a decent amount of expertise in the field, so I could be more just helping him with this particular aspect to build it. But all of them, have their quirks and ways that you work with them. And Donald Trump, the same, figuring out how to write for him, highly unique. But everyone has their own needs, everyone has their own styles, and everyone has what they need to be delivered to them to deliver the best speech for the circumstance. So a lot of the job is really just figuring people out.
On that note, can you kind of mention your story about Kevin McCarthy taking a bit to warm up to the idea of having a speechwriter? How much of being a speechwriter is kind of like managing up? And like, how do you convince the person you're writing for that you know what you're doing and what you've laid out, even if not every word is kept in there, but is a good path forward?
It very much depends on the circumstance that you're in and the personality of your boss. So I've had two main circumstances where managing up was the biggest portion of the job. When I first started working for Kevin McCarthy, now the latter years it was not that at all. With the relationship, it got a lot easier. Not that it was hard, but it became a lot more collegial and just free flowing. I would write things and I would know exactly how he wanted to say it and what he wanted to say, and it would be done. But Senator Vance was another one where a lot of it was managing up because he hadn't had a speechwriter before either. And it was he's so smart and so good on the stump that we were trying to figure out how to help him and not trip him up. We wanted to improve his execution. We didn't want to supplant him. So figuring out how to do that became my partner's job. And that was fun. It was very enjoyable to figure out how to get him what he needed. But then managing up, I had no need to manage up when it came to President Trump, because by the time I joined in a year into the administration, he had his team, he had his processes. I was fitting into a well-oiled machine, and it was execution, which had its own enjoyment and own difficulties. So if you get in on the ground floor, you're going to have to be the one to figure that out. I spoke with people who have written for Kevin, especially subsequently, and they said that it was a lot easier having all the processes already in place.
So a big part of speechwriting, and I guess really for any politician who goes in front of a microphone, is trying to avoid saying something in the wrong way or saying something in a way that will get interpreted differently than you intended. And obviously, especially as a conservative writing for conservatives, there's literally an army of people trying to do that. So it's to a certain extent, it's unavoidable. But if there are Yale students who want to do more public speaking and are afraid of that concern, what advice would you give them about how to think about ahead of time what they're going to say to avoid falling into those traps?
Well, the first one is haters going to hate. So you simply can't avoid that. Actually, I never go into anything wanting to make people angry, of course, but if you accept the fact that by trying to do good, you will, then it makes life a lot easier. Now, of course, read things, interpret them. The biggest thing that you care about in a speech is how the audience is going to interpret it. So I will read things to other people before I deliver it, share it with my wife or with colleagues or anything like that. And if something is not understandable, not clear, is taken the wrong way, that's my fault, because it's their interpretation that matters, not what I wrote. And those two things can be very different. So having some people who can read through and help things, friends, family members, stuff like that, everyone needs an editor. I don't care how far along you are in this. The first thing you write is not good enough. So you need to have an editor. But on a more fundamental level, I would also say the sooner you stop caring, the better it will be. Everyone has to cultivate their reputation. Reputations do matter, and it has a cachet in itself. But too zealously guarding one's reputation and fearing malign influences of other people is a recipe for unhappiness and, in my opinion, ultimate failure professionally too. I was unintentionally liberated from this simply by working for Donald Trump. I have very few left-wing friends anymore, and that's such is life. I wish it weren't so. I have people who will automatically disrespect me. I went to my 5-year reunion, and one of my old classmates, whom I certainly won't name, but she looked at me aghast, and that conversation ended, and we haven't spoken since.
Wow.
And you know what? Okay, it's fine. I tell people I was a Trump speechwriter. They have a conceived notion about me, but it liberates me because I don't have to. They already have those conceived notions, so I can operate as I do. I can be a little bit more controversial and speak my mind. So liberate yourself from that concern as much as you can, as quickly as you can, and you'll have a happier life.
So moving to kind of the next part of that, for students who are looking at getting into like that the public arena, or at least being public figures, and who want to effectively and directly communicate some message, and like who want to know how to do that, whether it's in writing, whether it's in a speech, what advice do you have for them for expressing themselves in a way that shares the ideas that they're trying to share?
Well, I guess it depends on the stage of the process you're in. In the beginning, I would say read voraciously, read good quality of every type of thing. You never know what could be helpful to you. And write as much as you can in low stakes environments. So what I mean by that is I hated writing in college because I was always writing for a grade. It was always essays, and there was a pressure put upon that caused me to think that I was a bad writer, and I just didn't like it. The moment I was on the Hill, all of a sudden I'd sit there and be like, well, there's 2 press releases today. We have an op-ed later this week, a blog post we wanted to get out. You need to help the social media person edit a few tweets, and 3 floor speeches in an event on Friday. And I look at that and I'm like, I need to write 3,000 words today. From 0 to 3,000 today. You stop having writer's block very quickly if you have that. And also, I mean, I hate to say it, nobody expected it all to be perfect because it couldn't be. Because I just and nobody's expecting a press release to be a beautiful thing. Nobody's expecting your op-ed to change the world. Nobody's expecting a floor speech that you're giving to an audience of like 3 people on C-SPAN to go and be like this glorious thing. But I still tried. I tried every single time to make them great, and I could accept the failures very easily, or not even just failures, just lack of beauty in them or lack of finesse because I had to produce more. So the stakes got supremely lowered such that I found ways to express myself and knew my own style. And everyone's a little different. I learned that I could internalize structures very quickly and almost unintentionally write a structured speech without mapping it out because I knew how the logical flow would go. That took years to be able to do. I used to have to map out everything and write. Now I'm much more efficient. And that was what scared me on pages. Like, where do I even start? I used to struggle to define a thesis. Now I know exactly what it is. I used to be afraid of large works, and now somebody can put a book in front of me that I'm editing for a publisher, and I'm like, okay, I know exactly the problem here. You know, their intro is jumbled. The second chapter should be number 7, and this whole chapter needs to go. Whatever it may be, you kind of learn these things over time, and that iterative practice and internalizing your own mechanisms and own the way you operate such that you don't even have to think about them anymore. It just becomes a part of how you write, saves you time and effort later such that you can focus even more on the particular construction of phrases and arguments, elevating the artistry of it above just the artifice.
So just take any opportunity you can.
Yeah, long story short, that would be actually a much more pithy and speechwriter-worthy way to say it.
So this question might be a little bit of a curveball, but it's also low stakes. So we are the Buckley Institute, and part of the podcast we ask our interviewees what impact Bill Buckley has had in their lives, whether directly if they happen to have met him before he passed away, or indirectly through National Review, Firing Line, YAF, any number of Buckley creations. So what impact has Buckley had on your life?
Well, I guess truth be told, I wouldn't be where I am if it weren't for Bill Buckley, because if he hadn't started National Review, I wouldn't have had the job that got me going in politics in the first place. So highly, highly grateful for that. I guess one of the things that I loved about Buckley as I was first exploring the conservative intellectual tradition in America was he ultimately was a practical man. I mean, fusionism as an independent philosophical theory doesn't actually make a ton of sense in my opinion. But it fit the political moment of the time and created some intellectual foundation, a rather robust intellectual foundation to a political movement that we needed in order to correct errors within America and take advantage of opportunities that weren't being exploited. That type of thinking can be sorely lost in Washington and outside of it, but I think has been regained in recent years. However different ideologically and style-wise Trump and Buckley are, Trump has reasserted that that ultimately politics is a matter of coalitions and a matter of winning, and it doesn't always make sense, and that's okay. So I respect Buckley a lot for his efforts in doing that, because you have to be able to make the argument even if the aspects of the coalition have natural friction between each other.
Well, thanks so much for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale. It's a pleasure having you on.
My pleasure.
That ends a great first episode of the year for Pod and Man at Yale. Subscribe to our podcast if you haven't already, and always remember, for God, for country, and for Yale, in that order.